Hey everybody, Jason here from AVPro Gen Radio. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. We did a first part of this webinar about a month or two ago, and I am with Jim Lumagen from Peterson. Jim Peterson from Lumagen. How you doing, Jim?
I'm doing good, thanks.
I had your email address in my head and I flip-flopped it, Jim@Lumagen. I called you Jim Lumagen. Sorry about that. How you doing?
I've been called that before.
Yeah. So Jim, great to see you. Great to hear from you. We did the first part of this, like I said, about a month or two ago, and we kind of went over the Lumagen line and talked about some of the features and really just what makes these processors so good. And we wanted to do this part two session to show people a little bit more hands-on and some of the setup and talk a little bit about what it takes to get one of these up and running. So thank you so much for joining me today, Jim.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, so we do have a few people, some very familiar faces on today's webinar, so thank you guys so much for coming and hanging out with us today. If you do have any questions throughout the webinar, we're probably going to go about 45 minutes to an hour or so. Feel free, I've got the chat box open here. It's a wide open forum, guys, so feel free, any questions that you might have for Jim as we're going through the presentation here, feel free to type those questions in. I'll leave some time at the end too, just in case there's questions we don't get to. So Jim, I think you had mentioned before that you had a few slides for us to look at, and then we were also going to look at an actual unit itself and look at some menus. So I'll leave it to you. Let's wherever you want to start.
Okay, well, I'll show a slide or two. I'm not sure we want to go through all the slides, so that would take our whole time.
Yeah,
So
no
maybe
worries.
I'll just do a couple slides, and what I can do is we have the slide set, and now we have basically a tech tip that goes into more detail than the slide set, and I can
Excellent.
send those out. And then rather than go through the slide, what I'll talk about is just some of the new simplifications we've done, and then
Perfect.
maybe go through a little bit of the menu. And then if anyone wants to type in questions and stuff, we can do that. So if we're going to get done in 45 minutes, we won't be able to cover everything, but we can get a start at it.
Yeah, that's okay. And if you guys do, if we do start running a little long on time, Jim, I'm okay to go a little bit longer. If you are, that's great. If some of the people watching want to go a little bit longer, we'll wait, see where we are in about 45 minutes or so. But yeah,
Okay.
that sounds great.
That sounds good. So I'm going to close my webcam,
Yeah, go for
or
it.
at least minimize it, and then I am going to maximize this. Oh, actually, get the right place here. Okay, and then show that.
Perfect. And guys, while you're watching
Okay.
live, there is a slider bar on your webinar control panel. If you wanted to see Jim's slides a little bit bigger, you can grab that slide bar and slide it up and down, and you can make my picture bigger, his picture bigger, whatever you want to see, however you want to look at it, whatever you're most comfortable with. Of course, if you're watching this as a recorded session, you can't do that. So this is only for the live people. But yeah, feel free, guys, to adjust those windows. And as Jim said before, feel free to type in those questions.
All right, very good. So the key that we have been doing on the Lumagen, the Lumagen is intended to be a studio reference quality device. That's our goal. Every single decision we make is how can we make this reference quality. And so from everything from electrical, low jitter, we basically are maximizing the quality of the signal. And then dynamic tone mapping has been a long, almost 2 years just on working on dynamic tone mapping. And then before that, we were working on just static tone mapping.
Sure.
And so to the point now where we have a movie producer who does post-production for a very large studio, has been evaluating the Lumagen, and basically he's saying it's in a completely different league than any other product out there available or coming up in the near future.
Good.
So I think we've succeeded in that, and in fact, he uses this in some of his own work. So the
Excellent.
Lumagen is, basically our motto has been for a long time: see what the director intended. And since he's a producer, not the term director, but he's the producer doing the post on these movies. I'm not allowed to say which studio, unfortunately, but I can assure you, you've seen these movies.
It's a big one. Yeah, sure.
And so I think we've succeeded. So as part of that, after we started getting to the dynamic tone mapping being so good at automatically adjusting for every scene, we've been
Mm-hmm.
able to simplify the setup. Before with static tone mapping, you had, the shape and the transition point and some of
Right.
these other things to really dial it in for your particular projector or your TV. And that's no longer necessary to mess with those. And in fact, we simplified the HDR parameter menu because we had a very famous producer who, not this one, but a different one, who actually had the settings all wrong. And I got a call one day going,
Oh
oh, no,
man.
those won't work. And
Oh
so we
boy.
were able to work through that. And I wasn't ever able to talk to the producer himself, but his, tech guy, we were
Mm-hmm.
able to get everything set up and dial everything in.
That's
And
awesome.
so what we wanted to do was simplify the setup. So
Mm-hmm.
now we have simplified the setup so much that for basic setup, I mean, there's a myriad of features, and they're there. You can use them or you cannot use them. You don't have to use some of these features, but
Mm-hmm.
they are there.
Sure.
And the really for the setup, just the basic Lumagen setup, you set your max light
Mm-hmm.
to 4 to 5 times your measured max light for a projector. If you have a television that's really bright, you might be setting it anywhere from 1 to 2x how much brightness you actually have. If you have a 1,000 nit television, you might be setting it at 1.5 to 2 times your actual maximum light output. If you have a 2,000 nit TV, you might be setting it to a 1 time. So we use the max light. It's not the max light of your projector. It's basically, and maybe we might have named it differently, if we thought differently back then, but it's not the max light. The max light really is your low ratio sets your max light, and that's usually set to 1 times your max light. So if you have a 100 nit projector, you set your low ratio so that equates to 100
Mm-hmm.
nit. And even though the low ratio, had I do it today, I probably would have made that max light, and then we would have had the other one, the high ratio. It's
Gotcha.
just I don't really want to go and change that.
Oh, sure, sure.
Yeah, the way we are, is you set max light to 4 to 5 times if you have a projector, and if you have a television, 1 to 2 times is really
Mm-hmm.
more, bright television. Um,
Jim, is
go
it
ahead.
is it just in case people didn't see part one of this series, maybe we could spend just maybe 2, 3 minutes on just why the Lumagen is something that you'd want. I mean, I'll give you personal experiences. I go calibrate systems all the time, and especially in projection systems where we're getting 50, 60, 70 nits. Sometimes this is a product that you'd put in line after all your devices before your projector and help out the projector quite a bit. We've seen these go into several systems where people were complaining about HDR being too dark and stuff like that. And it really seems to be really a lifesaver in those situations.
Well, very good. So yeah, basically a lot of people call the Lumagen a fix-it box. So we can fix pretty much all your video issues. And we don't do pincushion or barrel distortion correction, partly because it would actually make the picture worse, and partly it should be in the projector if you're going to do things optically rather than electrical. But everything else, aspect ratio control, auto aspect, you can have multiple settings. You can, in fact, in a lot of cases, we have people who want to. I've got a 16:9 screen,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm using, these Apple TVs throughout the house, and I want everything to fill my 16:9 screen. And
Right.
so the auto aspect can do that. You can zoom in, you can crop, you can set up different settings for each input aspect. There's just a
Mm-hmm.
myriad of features that you can use, and basically, those are just toolbox kind of things. But at this point, really, the dynamic tone mapping is just the best out there by,
So good.
it's in its own league is what
Sure.
the producer's saying. So I'm using his people. I could say I think it's this good, but it's
Yeah.
better to say, hey, someone who does this for a living
Right.
is
Exactly.
access to this producer actually was looking at the Lumagen against the studio reference masters,
Wow.
um, on a, at the time, $1 million Dolby cinema projector on a Pulsar monitor and the new Sony monitor.
Sure.
And basically all the cases he's looking to make sure, and he's been very helpful in feedback when he, say, go look at this scene, you could make it better. And we
Mm-hmm.
would go off and we'd work on those scenes.
That's awesome,
So
Jim. That's very
the
cool.
the key is a lot of our dealers won't sell a projector without a Lumagen. If
That's
you're
a
a
safe bet.
dealer, if you're a dealer and you're selling a projector, what I tell the dealers is, let's say you've got a $15,000 to $20,000 budget. Well, you
Hmm.
take the Lumagen, you take it out of the budget, and what you got left, you're gonna get the best projector you can, and the pair will outperform by a long shot if you spend all that money on the projector.
Yes, yes,
If
yes,
you've got a
totally agree.
$5,000 budget, obviously that's not going to work. But
Hmm.
even at 10,000, you're close enough. You can get a JVC RS1000 and the
Hmm.
Lumagen, and that's going to give you an amazing picture, or a Sony 275 or something like
Sure.
that.
Yeah.
Because we are going to do the tone mapping, and we're going to do it better than the projectors are going to do it.
Um, Jim, are people using these also on a lot of flat panels that you've seen lately, or is it mainly projectors?
We are primarily projectors,
Hmm.
and just from a mathematical point of view, if you have 1,000 nit television and you have 1,000 nit movie, and your
Hmm.
TV is set up correctly, which
Hmm.
often you can't do. The TV, some TVs just aren't hard to set that up right.
Sure.
You don't need tone mapping, right? Because
Right.
you can show the entire range.
Hmm.
Now, then again, if you have a 4,000 nit movie, you still want to do tone mapping, and they're a smaller fraction, but they do exist.
Sure.
And in fact, what we find is the fact that we can set the high bright scenes differently than the dark scenes, you can actually use that feature to optimize your television.
That's
The
cool.
big problem is you're spending $6,000 or more on a video processor for your $1,500
Right.
television.
Yes, that's always
We
the
have
conundrum.
people, have people that like that equation
Yep.
because they only have room, especially in Europe. I've only got room for this television. I want it to look as good as I possibly can make
Hmm.
it. So we do sell in Europe. We sell more into television than we do in the U.S. for sure.
Cool.
So
Very
it can
interesting.
help. There's less there. I mean, if you want to fill your screen with all the different sources on your
Right.
television, the Lumagen's great for that.
Hmm.
We had one client who bought 3 Lumagens. He had 3 Apple TVs, and he wanted them to automatically always, even for 235 content, he wanted us to zoom and clip
Wow.
off some stuff. So for all 3, and it goes into a matrix switch. And so
Nice.
no matter where you are, all his setups, even his theater, are set for 16:9,
Wow.
and the
Very
Lumagen's
cool.
doing all that setup for him.
Nice.
Okay, so um, the key remaining feature you need to figure out is whether your projector or television, what, how well does it do in a Rec 2020 color space? There's a number of high-end projectors that are really designed more for commercial use that do
Hmm.
not, they accept 2020, but they do not mathematically do it correctly.
Gotcha.
And some of them only have, like DLPs are especially like this, is they only have a 709 color gamut.
Hmm.
And so the Lumagen in the latest release, what I mean, we're going back and forth, and I decided that this time, because unfortunately there's so many mistakes in HDMI. That's a lot. When we say we fix bugs on our releases, most of the time, the bug we fixed was because some other device was screwed up and we had to work around
Sure.
it.
Sure.
So one of the things that we have to work around is a lot of devices will, they'll go into HDR if you give them the HDR flag, but if you
Hmm.
give them the 2020 flag without the HDR flag, they won't go to 2020. They just ignore it.
Right.
And I think that's a design failure, but that's not something we can fix. So in the
Mm.
latest release, because we want it out of the box as good as possible, we want to minimize the setup, is we turn on our HDR dynamic tone mapping by default,
Oh.
but we set the output for CMS 0 and 1. So CMS 0 is STR, CMS 1 is
Hmm.
HDR. Um, we set them both to STR 709 so that even on a crappy projector with only Rec 709 color space, you're going to have a really pretty amazing looking picture out to Rec 709 limits, which is most of the content, not all, but most of the content. And
Sure.
then the decision you need to make is, can my projector do a good job with Rec 2020? If you have a JVC, the answer is yes for
Hmm.
the 2000, 3000, and the RS4500, the RS1000. The answer is yes for Sony. Any of their 4K HDRs do a good job with Rec 2020. So that setup, which you would go into CMS 0 and CMS 1 and change the color space to SDR 2020, and manually put the projector in a 2020 mode. And that's key because the projectors aren't, if we output 2020, we're telling the projector, we're outputting 2020,
Right.
but so far, almost none of them actually pay attention to that flag. They
Interesting.
should, but they don't.
Yeah.
So manually change your projector to the right color space. And you can kind of tell, you look at a highly colorful image
Oh, yeah.
and you can go back and forth, set the projector to 709, set the projector to 2020 if we're sending it to
Hmm.
2020, and you'll see the difference. One will look much better than the other.
Sure.
And so you can decide if it's doing a good enough job for that. If you're a calibrator, obviously you can check that. You could do, do the LUT and everything. But I'm not going to get into LUTs right now. So this is intended, by the way, to be a step up technically from our intro the last time we had this webinar. It's not going to train you how to do calibration.
Oh, sure.
And so, I mean, I had one gentleman who was very excited, and I said, but just beware, you're not going to learn to calibrate from this. I will touch on a couple calibration things, but
Hmm.
really, calibration, you should take the class. There
Sure.
are classes that you can take for that.
There's 3 or 4 sometimes days worth of stuff. We can't fit it all in an hour. I wish we
Yes.
could, but yeah,
Yeah,
it's just
yeah,
not
yeah.
possible.
Okay, so the other thing is EDIDs. EDIDs are
Hmm.
another good concept in HDMI and DVI in the day, but they're poorly implemented in a lot of stuff. So the Lumagen, we actually had a customer who worked, I'm sure I can say this, Microsoft Xbox One team, and he
Hmm.
basically had us send the EDID to the team, and they vetted it. They had a couple little minor things. This was like 3-4 years ago. I don't know, five
Sure.
almost. And so they said, make these 2 tweaks and it'll be an amazingly good EDID. So we use that EDID. If you manually set the EDID, that's the EDID we're going to use.
Oh,
And the
cool.
EDID works with most everything.
Good.
Problems with EDIDs, like most things in HDMI, is two companies can have what they believe and what may be justifiably correct implementations, and they won't work together.
Right.
Uh, and it's because the EDIDs have grown by accretion, and
Hmm.
so we actually back in the DVI days, we actually wrote our own, and it wasn't working with certain devices, so we basically threw it out. We found one that worked with
Hmm.
other devices, and then we've used that ever since. Well, that was the base of it. So HDMI EDIDs are very key, and they can make a difference between your system working and not
Oh, yeah.
working. Um, we also have issues with EDIDs 2K devices like the 1080 DirecTV box and some of the
Hmm.
streamers. If you say I can do 18 gigahertz, that EDID's larger and different than
Right.
if it's a 1080 EDID.
Right.
And so we actually have the manual way to, I'll say dumb down the EDID to 1080 and
Hmm.
those devices. And the problem is what happens with that other EDID is you'll get video, you just won't get the right
It won't be
audio,
right.
or the audio will act weird, it won't work all the time. And specifically for DirecTV, making that change, you go from like very unreliable audio to, yeah, it works good stuff.
Yeah. We
So the manual EDID, and then you can dumb it down to 1080 for 1080 devices if you
good.
need to.
Good. We
Other,
our
go
own
ahead.
our own internal tech support department, we talk to those folks on a daily basis, and they're taking calls from integrators all over the place. And we did a little survey about a year or two ago, and it turns out that like 80% of our tech support calls are EDID related. It's crazy.
Yes. Yeah. So we recommend two things. That you manually set the output rate on the Lumagen,
Hmm.
that you manually set the EDIDs from the Lumagen back to your sources,
Hmm.
and that can actually make power on order too. So for example, we
Yeah.
have devices like 4K players that if they don't see HDR as a format capability when they turn on or start the movie, and later something, if you turn your projector on later, the Lumagen in auto mode doesn't know you want to report HDR until it sees
Right.
it in the projector. Well, 20, 30, 40 seconds later, the projector turns on, the Lumagen says, oh, now we can do, because it
Oh.
toggles its hot plug. We reread it, said, oh, now we toggle all the hot plugs back to the
Hmm.
sources. Say, now we can do HDR, and they just ignore that. And so by doing this, you basically, you don't always have to. I don't here in our theater, but if you turn the projector on, wait 5-10 seconds for it to boot, turn the Lumagen on, wait five
Hmm.
seconds for it to boot, and then you turn everything else on, that helps the EDID startup work for you.
Excellent tip. That's great. Good tip.
So way out of order, but that's where we're going here. Um, so there's lots and lots of settings. Image-based auto aspect is very popular. It works
Hmm.
very well. We have features like if you have a Kaleidoscope Strato or a Kaleidoscope Strato with a CoStar, which is a second device that you can then pair them together and see all the movies on one screen.
Hmm.
We have a Strato feature that's called the CoStar feature that we've done with the Kaleidoscope. And we just have all these little features that we're doing as things come up. We have I almost call it the Jim feature because I'm the one that said, I have a CoStar, I want this to work.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so basically the Strato menu is always 60 hertz, but I always
Mhm.
watch movies, almost always. And or the few times I want to watch music videos, I wanted to be able to have the menu come out of the Lumagen at 24 hertz. But
Right.
when you actually watch 60 hertz video, I wanted to see it at 60. And so
Sure.
now we have a feature, the Strato has an OSD feature that basically flags it as graphics through HDMI. So we can use that feature. Okay, this is the OSD and it's 60 hertz. We can output it at 24. This is a movie, 24, great, we'll output at 24. Oh, this is video at 60 hertz, we better switch to video. And my projector is an excellent, JVC RS 4500, love the
Mhm.
projector, but it does take about 17 seconds to get a picture.
Yeah.
So,
Sure. Sure. Sure.
um, a key question, what Lumagen should I buy? And I'm not going to go through all these slides, but this one I think is important. If you're a dealer or a customer, why would I want 9 gigahertz? Isn't that old technology on the input side? And the answer is the 9 gigahertz works great for non-HDR sources
Hmm.
because of the chip technology. So this is an implementation detail. There's a chip per input. So if you have our input cards have two inputs on them, so you can have up to 4 input cards on a 4446 or 2 input cards on a 4242. So there's 2 inputs, they're either both 9s or they're both 18s on the input side. If you've got enough HDR sources with your 18 gigahertz, use 9s for the rest.
Sure.
And we may not always be selling 9s in the future because, for example, they don't
Yeah.
make them anymore.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So we, when we're out of our inventory, we will, switch to 18. But the 18s, because there's 2 inputs on an input chip, and the chip vendor never lived up to their promise of fast switching between those 2 inputs, they switch slower. It can add, because the chip has to turn off one input side, turn on the
Hmm.
other, has to lock on, the face lock loops have to lock on, you have to do the HDCP, which generally takes a couple seconds, and it can
Hmm.
add 5 seconds to your switching. And so what we recommend is you use 18 gigahertz for your HDR sources, and if you
Hmm.
can, you don't have to, but if you can, one input per 18 gigahertz card. And then, for example, in a 4242, if you had two 18 gigahertz sources and 2 others, you could use an 18 and a 9, or you could use two 18s. You can use 18 gigahertz. It's only really the switching that's a little bit different between the two. 18 gigahertz, many sources like Apple TVs appear to not do HDR unless you've got an 18 gigahertz input. And if you're at 4K 60, which a lot of them end up defaulting to, that makes sense because they don't dither and they don't want to truncate the
Hmm.
10-bit HDR to 8 bits. Little different on I'm going to switch to the output side now. The Lumagen, we spend a lot of time perfecting what we call output dither. If you don't know what
Hmm.
dither is, Google it. Basically, you're adding a little bit of a random noise to the low bit. And what that does is that, like at 8 bits, it makes it look to the human, especially with 4K. Um, it makes it look to the human like it's more like an 11-bit, kind of quality
Yeah.
depth. And so you can, with 8-bit on a 9 gigahertz output, you run 4K 60 and you're only 8 bits, but it looks more like it's 10, 11, or even the full
Hmm.
12. Um, and so the 9 gigahertz, the real reason we recommend the 9 gigahertz output, two factors. One is it has slower edge rates than the 18. Well, first of all, TVs have great inputs for the most part. The
Hmm.
mainstream TVs lock on in 3 seconds, and they're very tolerant of cable issues. Unlike projectors, which generally take 15, seconds or longer to lock on and are very intolerant of
Sure.
any kind of cable issues at all in most part. I mean, not 100% which way, whatever. Um, but the 9 gigahertz outputs have slower edge rate. So if you get the same visual picture, and I've done an A/B comparison on the RS-4500 to here in the theater on a
Hmm.
14-foot screen to say, I pause this difficult scene, I find the hard scenes and say, how does it look at 18? How does it look at 9 at 4K 60? These are HDR sources that I'm running at 4K 60, and I just want to see, is there any difference between the 9 and the 18? I have to say, I can't see any difference. I can't say
Wow.
no one would ever see any difference in any cases.
Right.
Um, but
I
um,
mean, if you're going to see problems, I think you would definitely see them on a 14-foot screen. And if you're
yeah,
not,
yeah.
that's excellent.
Yeah, and I even cheated. I tell people you got to evaluate at viewing distance, but I actually walk
Yeah.
up to the screen and look.
Oh, sure, sure.
So for testing purposes, that's good. Don't make judgments on whether this is good or bad unless you're sitting at viewing distance, because for example, at 4K, I'm sitting at less than one screen width, which is very close
It's close,
considered
yeah.
to most people. In that, at 4K, I've got 2 pixel areas within the smallest area human vision you can see, which experts say is 1 arc second or one
Hmm.
sixtieth of 1 degree, and that I have 2 pixels within that area, and that's why
Wow.
I'm so really against 8K, especially for transmission. Is you already have 2 pixels within the smallest area you can see. Why would you want to multiply that by 4?
Hmm.
Wouldn't you want better 4K pixels rather than more
More.
pixels,
Right.
because you can't
Right.
see the more pixels and you can see the better pixels. And
Absolutely. Yeah.
so, especially for transmission, where compression artifacts will be worse at 8K than they will be at 4K,
Hmm.
I actually really would like to see someone, difficult to do, but do a test. Transmit 4K with the same bit rate as 8K and the same quality or even potentially better because you've got more, more per bit kind of
Right.
thing versus 8K, and tell me in a double blind test which of those looks better. I predict you will either have a tie or the 4K will win. Transmitting in 8K makes no sense because it's always bandwidth limits that
Hmm.
decide how many bits you have. And for a given bit budget, 4K should look as good as 8K because you can't see the 8K extra
Right.
pixels, first of all. So you're transmitting things you can't see and losing things like bit depth and compression artifacts
Hmm.
that you can see. And so I don't know. That's a digression. I'm very against any kind of 8K connections, except possibly if you're a gamer and you're
Yeah.
sitting a quarter screen width away because you can, and you have baseband video. Well, maybe there's a slight chance there might be some tweaky little visible difference. Hardly
Yeah.
not, but probably not, but maybe. But other than that, you should have 8K. At
Hmm.
least for connectivity. This 2.1, everyone asks me, when are you going to do 2.1? Is, well, I'm not sure. I mean, it's stupid
Yeah.
to do 8K. I may have to if people ask me to do it, but there's no reason to transmit at 8K. Now, I will say, if you want to have an 8K television because it was the dot pitches of the manufacturing and this size of the screen gives me 8K, that's fine. But realize, if you have 4K, which you really should, you're scaling it to 8K, and if you got a crappy scaler, you may be creating
Yeah.
artifacts that make the 8K look worse
It might make it
than
look
the
worse.
4K.
Yeah. Exactly.
So same thing, we had HD TVs when they first came out.
Yeah.
Without Lumagen, people would say,
Hmm.
how come it looks worse than my old SD TV? And that's because the scalers are not very good. Now, I
I
would
remember
say
those days.
yeah, I would say the Lumagen scaling is an exception. And, we are looking at 8K because it's
Hmm.
customers demand it and are willing to pay
Right.
for it. We're going to do it if we can.
Hmm.
It's a difficult thing to do. We actually have to do it with field programmable gate arrays in our technology that we're going to have to be looking at that. But we are looking at it. People ask me, when are you going to do it? And I said, well, if we do it, it's a long way off because we're really working on 4K. 4K is really, a definite improvement from 2K, no question.
Sure.
4K can look better than 2K, but I'd rather see people work on better 4K than on
Hmm.
8K. It would be and rather than doing 420 compression for, movies, make it 444.
Yeah.
Make it 12-bit, make it near lossless or
Right.
lossless. You know, even with the latest compression schemes, there's an excessive amount of compression that if you were to stay at 4K, as bandwidth goes up, you could get, you know, you
You
could
can get
make
away
it
with it.
better.
I've talked to so many people about this exact topic, and myself and you and many others have all said the same thing. More pixels sounds great and all, but what about better pixels? You know, deeper blacks, wider color gamuts, and stuff like that. Totally with you on that one.
Agreed. So, I mean, I guess I'm on a platform where people can't argue with me today, but you know, I'd be happy to talk with you. It's a mathematical thing. I look at things, you know, HDR dynamic tone mapping. It's all because of the math. I basically did the initial algorithm, not having seen any because we didn't have them at
Hmm.
the time, and it's all based on the math. And
Right.
so, if the math and the physics say, you know, you should do something, then you should do it. But if the math and
Hmm.
the physics say there's no advantage and there's a probable disadvantage,
Right.
then don't do it. And that's
Right.
transmitting at 8K is a probable disadvantage because of compression artifacts you're going to have to
Hmm.
have. You're compressing 4 times as many pixels in the same bandwidth.
Right.
And bandwidth always the limit, even on disks and stuff, there's always a limit in the bandwidth. And so there's going to be a trade-off. And the question is, can you see it or not? I mean, you've got 8K pixels, so maybe it's going to look as good as 4K, but
Right.
4K on a setting less than 1x the screen width is, I don't think I'd ever want to sit closer than this for a movie.
Yeah.
You're already over the human vision capability with 2 pixel areas per, and you could, you know, do the math, figure out, confirm that what I'm saying, you know, please do. And I'm actually trying to get people to, you know, stand up and say 8K is dumb. Let's do 4K. Let's make it better. Let's do better compression.
And plus,
Anyway,
if you're sitting that close, man, you end up watching the movie like this. You know, you're watching the characters go from this side to the next, and I tend to sit a little closer in my own personal two systems at home, but as close as I am, I wouldn't want to go any closer than that. It's just too close. You start to see too much.
so you're saying you're 1x, or you're saying you're closer than 1x?
No, just barely over 1x.
1/x. Yeah. So
Yeah,
1x
yeah,
is kind of what I recommend to people. If you've
yeah.
got a good quality projector or a good
Hmm.
quality television,
Yeah.
and you are able to set 1x the screen width, you are probably about optimal to one and a
Hmm.
half times. If you have like a 6 foot, you know, 72-inch TV or something, you're probably more like a minimum of 1.5 to 2x, just because of the way the rooms get set up. You're 12 feet
Totally.
away, you know, or, you know, you got a 5 foot wide screen and you're 12 feet away or 10 feet away. And so
Hmm.
that's just working out. But for a big projection, then 1x is actually a pretty good place to be. I like it.
Sure.
I don't see artifacts with 4K content. Even 2K content looks pretty good.
Good.
DVD content, yeah, a little marginal on a 14
Mm,
foot screen, but
yeah.
I still, you know, if I have a movie and I want to watch it, and I have it in DVD, I'll
Yeah.
fire it up. So
Yeah. Sure.
um,
Definitely.
HDMI cables are key, and I know
Hmm.
AVPro sells some cables and stuff, but they're key. Um, I just that's just really key. And unfortunately, we've seen a lot of the fibers. The fiber isn't the issue, but they don't put enough attenuation in their inputs for fast edge rates. And one of the things on the Lumagen is the chip vendor decided to have a little bit faster edge rates. They're in spec. They have some of the lowest jitter ever measured from the guy who did the testing told me, but they are a little bit faster, and they do have to have devices that understand that if you're gonna plug a, you know, a fiber receiver directly into the back of the Lumagen, that
Hmm.
one has to have enough attenuation to mimic what you would have had if you had a cable, because all the HDMI devices are designed to drive a cable.
Hmm.
And then people ask me, well, you know, what about cables? And I said, well, never use less than a 2 meter cable.
Right.
And that's because I call it the Goldilocks problem. The porridge is too hot.
Yes.
They are designed basically to make them work at longer distances, because before an 8 DVI, the spec was 5 meters. That's all you could do. And even in that day, they said, okay, well, HDMI 1.1 and on, we want to drive as long a cable as we can, and how long a cable you can drive gets shorter and shorter as you speed it up. So right now, the optimal, I'm telling people, is 2 to maybe 4 meters is the
Hmm.
optimal. Don't ever use less than a 2 meter cable. I have people say, I'm using a 1 meter cable, it works fine. What are you talking about? I said, well, you got lucky.
Well, you got
You
lucky.
know,
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
it
We
can work.
I get the straight. We teach this in class about using cables that are too short because you can go anywhere and buy these little 1/2 meter and 1 meter jumper cables, and I've used millions of them in the past. And I've probably gotten lucky a million times. But when I learned that the HDMI cable can be too short, I'm sure I had a weird puzzled look on my face because when I tell people that now, they get the same weird puzzled look on their face. It's like, yes, absolutely, the cable can be too short. And we've had plenty of instances where somebody's using one of those little 1/2 meter jumpers, they swap it out for a 2 meter cable, problem solved. So
Yeah.
excellent tip, and I'm glad that you're seeing that as well.
Yeah, no, I from early, I mean, the first, I
Yeah.
mean, what, the first early days of HDMI 1.1, I was telling people that I had several dealers call me a liar.
Oh gosh.
I mean,
Like,
like just
why would
flat out,
you
you're
lie about
lying to me. It's your
it?
product. No, it's the cable. Just go to a 2 meter cable. I
Right.
was able to finally convince them, and they think that at least a
Yeah.
couple times a month we have a system. I got audio dropouts. What's wrong?
Hmm.
What's your cables? Oh, I've got this and this. Oh, how long are they? 1 meter. Well, switch them to
Switch
two,
them.
switch them to three.
Hmm.
And that fixes it. And they go, oh, I didn't know. And I go,
Yeah.
yeah, most people don't.
Yeah, we're
um,
totally on the same page with that. We're saying the same thing in our tech support department and in our training classes and stuff. 2 meters is like a really 2 meters is really the magic number there. And I'm hearing also, you may have heard this too, or maybe you just know better than I do, but I'm hearing with HDMI 2.1, they're saying not to go any shorter or longer than 2 meters without any sort of different, extension methods or something like that. They're specifically saying 2 meters on those, I think.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So the problem, a lot of people are saying, you can't mathematically go longer than 1 meter and meet all of the tolerances in an 8K system. So I think they're pushing that to try to get to 2 meters.
Yeah.
And so for a
Um,
passive cable, 2 meters is going to be probably the right length for 8K.
there's a question that came in, Jim, on the slide that we're on right now from Matt. He says, and maybe you don't have experience with the specific one, but AVPro has a HDMI extender. We call it the 444 kit. We use our own compression and does 18 gigs and all that good stuff. Matt asks if you've had any experience with those and if you've had any problems with those specifically.
Um, I have no experience other than I know that people are using the AVPro stuff. I will say that in general, when people say they're using the AVPro stuff, they're not having problems. And people who use other stuff have said, I use other stuff and now I use AVPro stuff. So
Yeah.
I don't have a lot of personal experience,
Hmm.
but I think it should be good. One thing
Yeah.
I will say is if you're coming from the Lumagen, you'd be better off having a 9 gigahertz output, running at 9 gigahertz rather than doing the recompression in the
Right.
actual cables. I know they're trying to make it low loss, but the
Yeah.
compression that we're doing with the dithering is in the human terms exceptional, and you might as well just use the 9 gigahertz and you're going to have less cable issues. There's no
Sure.
reason to compress it again. And so that would be something I would recommend, that you run the output at 9. Even if you've got it 18, you can
Cool.
run it at 9. And of
Good
course,
tip.
for 4K 24, if you're watching movies, both the 9 and the 18 gigahertz outputs run at 9. And that's just because of the data rates and stuff.
Sure. Good tip. Okay, good. Good.
Okay.
Matt, hopefully that answers your question. If not, Matt, feel free to follow up in the question box.
And nothing against HD base T, but at 4K, I just have had too many dealers have too many problems, and I still get people that I only have this cable and I have to make it work,
Hmm.
and it's always a tough thing for them to do, and a lot of times they end up biting the bullet and running
Yeah.
a fiber or a longer active metal cable. So avoid the balance. They just at 4K, I mean, even at 2K, they were pushing more bits through those cables than were really intended by the design of the cable.
Right.
And at 8K, I'm sorry, at 4K, that definitely is true. Okay, I think I might switch to the menu system and show
Yeah.
people a little bit about that. Um,
Yeah.
just real quick on this slide, before I jump to that, is if you got a system and you're not sure its configuration, do a factory reset and a
Hmm.
save. I've done that to myself where the people don't really want to do it, and we go through it, and there's some setting that they've got that we just can't figure out what they did, and it's just not really, doing the right thing. If you do the factory reset, the setup is really quick, other than maybe a calibration. So if you have a calibration, you can still do a factory reset and just do everything except the CMS. And
Sure.
that way we added that in the save menu. So there's a menu 0999, which is the quick and dirty do everything. But
Mm-hmm.
we also have in the save menu, I want to reset only my CMS. I want to reset everything but my CMS. And
Mm-hmm.
so you can say, okay, let's get this, because what happens is I get people with a complicated system. They'd already tried to set it up. They got it wrong. They called me and we're trying to work through what they did wrong. And it's
Yeah.
just
You got to
easier to
backwards
start
engineer it
over.
all. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we can do automatic by default. We try to be automatic, but what I recommend again is manually doing all that. Um, Lots of optimization, switching speed, output rate.
Mm-hmm.
We have a couple of commands like menu 0873 for 9 gigahertz, 0874 for 18. Those are 4K 60, 50 only. And then you can have 24 hertz. You can do 4K 4096 wide. So we have some direct commands to help you speed up your setup. And in the
Cool.
manual online on the back, there's direct codes. Most of those codes are there.
Good.
Radiance Pro 18 gigahertz, I touched on that. If you had a 44, 46, 18G, all 8 are 18 gigahertz, you would put your inputs as 1357, 8642 for most to least use. So your 4 most used sources go to separate chips. That's for speed, but also
Mm-hmm.
they don't have to lock on. Locking on in HDMI, a lot of people don't understand that mathematically it's not guaranteed you will lock on. You should lock on pretty much practically all the time, every time,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a mathematical probability, just like bit error rate, that it won't lock on. And so you're better off not having to do that. Use 1, 3, 5, and 7 for the 44, 46. Manual output rates, aspect ratio control. You can do output aspect per input aspect. I use that on my screen. For example, I have a 240 screen, but
Mm-hmm.
I programmed it so it says if the input's 240, my screen's 240. The input's 235. Well, the screen's still 235. Oh, wait a second, that's not the same.
Yeah.
So you can do tricks like that to basically, you want to fill your screen. You don't want a little bit of black on the sides
Sure.
and stuff. You can do stuff like that. I'm just kind of like zipping through these, some manual EDID settings. We already talked about that. We simplified the parameter menu. One thing we did do in the parameter menu now is if you're in user mode, so you don't want to be in service mode for this, but user mode, max light, which is actually in your active CMS, so CMS1 by default, is
Mm-hmm.
shown in the input menu, so you can tweak it, which, that's one of the things you have to, ideally tweak, and you may even want to fiddle. A lot of people like to fiddle with it, so we made it easier to change. Remember, in the parameter menu, you do have to press OK to accept it, and you still have to save. Don't forget, Lumagen, you've got to save your changes.
Mm-hmm.
This from day one, that's what was, because there's a lot of times people will make changes like, oh, that's not right. What's wrong? You just turn the unit off. You
Yeah.
didn't do a save, turn it back on, and you'll get back to your
You'll be
last
back.
saved settings.
Perfect.
And so, by the way, is save, once you know you got it right, save it so that as you progress through um, other things, if you mess it up, you can just
Mhm.
turn it off and back on.
Jim, I have a question for maybe folks who are listening to the webinar today. Um, and we touched on this last time too. I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. When you go into a system that, say, it's a projector and some sources and a switch and a Lumagen, we're still going to be are we still going to be calibrating the projector first? In other words, maybe the signal generator is plugged directly into the projector. We get the projector sorted out, and then we go to the Lumagen and make adjustments there. Does that sound right still?
Okay, so yeah, so you want to get your projector into a good state, or your television into a
Hmm.
good state. And that good state is like, I tell people turn off anything that has to do with frame interpolation.
Yes.
Mathematically, frame
Yes.
interpolation is guaranteed to create artifacts. It will
Hmm.
create artifacts. And in fact, they're limited to what you can do in the horsepower you've got in televisions and TV and projectors. And it's just not a good thing. And so many times people are saying, it doesn't look right. What's wrong with your Lumagen? I said, well, turn off frame interpolation. Oh, well, yeah, now it looks good. And so definitely you want to get your projector dialed into a good setting, get your color gamut set, do your 100% white point in your projector TV if you're doing a true calibration and stuff before you go to the Lumagen. And then you basically do tweaks in the Lumagen as necessary.
Perfect.
So some good projectors, like I have an RS4500, The 2000, 3000 from JVC, the 995 from Sony's are
Hmm.
pretty good. If you get those kind of dialed in, there's a little issue with doing a 3D LUT with Calman in 2020 space, but if you get the projectors dialed in, you may only need to do your 1D LUT. In fact,
Yeah,
on my RS 4500, Chris Steering was here, and he actually did just do a 1D LUT in Lumagen because the 3D was the 3D LUT points were pretty accurate, low DE.
good.
So do your
Um,
projector first. If you're going to use an external pattern generator, that's actually fine. The Lumagen has the internal patterns,
of course, yep,
all the patterns that you need. It's perfectly fine. Some calibers say, I just like using an external pattern
yeah,
generator because
that's
then I
okay.
know it's exactly what's going to happen from my
Right.
source. I go, well, that's a perfectly valid idea if you want to do
Yeah.
that. Now, our input to our frame buffer is very accurate. So you're
Hmm.
talking, any differences are almost nits. But if you want to do that, feel free to use an external pattern generator.
I know every calibrator is different, of course, and some people go like guys like Chris will go, to the nth degree if they have the time to. If somebody like me, I typically calibrate. I schedule my calibrations for about 4 hours. Usually is the appointment. Typically, realistically, it takes 2 to 3, but I like to leave a little bit of buffer in there. Um, how much time do you think once the projector's dialed in and then you start working on the Lumagen? About how much time does the average calibrator spend on the Lumagen? Is it something like a couple hours or half an hour, or what are you seeing?
It really depends on how, like you said, how much time and what level of quality you want to get to.
Sure, sure.
I think that 4 hours is a minimum. I mean,
Yeah,
it can take if I do a full 21 by 21 by 21 profile, it can take 4 or 5 hours just for that, depending on how you
just
set
for
everything
that.
up. You might be
Sure.
able to get done in 2 or 3, depending
Hmm.
how your settings are. But if you're doing a full 3D LUT with light space, and you're doing 9,000 point reading just to get the profile, it
Right.
can take that just alone. You're talking
Totally.
3 4 hours.
Even with a fast
So
meter. Sure.
yeah, so a lot of calibrators take a full day to do a
Got it.
calibration.
Cool. Cool.
And it just depends on your budget, and you can talk it just like many things is, okay, I've got this budget, what can you improve my picture for this budget? Yes,
Yeah.
I can, or no, I
Sure.
can't. You know,
Yeah.
so
Good.
anyway, it's hard to say
Good.
how long a calibrator can do. There are calibrators who probably take longer, and it's a good thing, and there are calibrators who take longer, and yeah, they didn't really do anything more than they could have
Yeah.
done in a shorter period
Totally. I
of
mean,
time.
I'll say even with the last time I did a really long 3D LUT on my flat panel at home, even using my Klein, which is, as you know, a very fast meter, a 3,500 point lookup table was still like 90 minutes just by itself. So yeah,
Yep.
definitely take into consideration if you're going to do LUTs, how many points, how fast your meter is, and you can get a pretty good idea of how much time you could spend.
Okay. And now
Cool.
one thing I will say on calibration, I do run into calibrators who refuse to use the Lumagen internals. And the reason is all I can figure is they just don't want to bother. They don't
Hmm.
want to learn. So if you're going to hire a calibrator, or you're a dealer and you're going to be a calibrator, I think it makes good sense to learn what the Lumagen can do and how it can do it. And then you can know, like, if you don't need to go into the Lumagen 3D LUT, well, don't do it. But you
Don't
need
do
to
it. Yeah.
know when you should and when you shouldn't. I have had customers who called me and said, hey, the calibrator came and he never did anything with the Lumagen, and I don't like the result. And that's a lot of
Yeah.
times that's the true, is they did what they knew how to do and left. And
Hmm.
I've actually had to send other calibrators out to those sites,
Yeah.
and the customer ended up paying twice for a calibration because they picked the wrong calibrator. There's only really a few calibrators that are really good enough to do justice to getting you the absolute better picture.
Sure.
Having an ISF certification is not enough. And there are a lot of things Lumagen can do that some calibrators don't really even understand.
Sure.
Uh, so anyway,
Yeah.
be careful when you pick a calibrator. I think this is mostly for dealers. If you're a dealer, train
Hmm.
your calibrators to know what's going on
Right.
and get them the right training they need so they can do the good job. The Lumagen has features that aren't generally available in TVs.
Right.
TVs now are getting 1D LUTs, I think,
Hmm.
some of them. And
Some of them,
so
yeah.
that's a good thing. I mean, Ours
Yeah.
is a 21-point parametric. You can, if you really want, you can go in manually and start really tweaking, dialing it in, but that takes time and stuff.
I will say, Jim, just to give you kudos, man. If you're a Lumagen dealer, your articles that you put out to your dealers, I feel like I get one about once a month or maybe sometimes more than that, but you're always giving tech tips and you're very willing to help people over the phone. And I'll tell you guys from personal experience from running into Lumagens on site where I had a question, Jim is excellent at helping you out. So, don't be shy. Feel free to reach out if
Yeah.
if you have questions.
Yeah, I try to be available unless I'm on the phone. And of
Hmm.
course, the 5 calls I've gotten in the last hour,
Yeah, yeah.
they're calling, why is he not answering the phone? Uh,
Yeah,
but
I had one time. The Lumagen, for whatever reason, hadn't had a firmware update probably since it was unboxed, and it was a couple years old. And I'd never done a firmware update on one before, and I'm like, man, there's no way Jim's going to answer the phone. Just a random phone call in the middle of the day. I probably got to schedule something with him. And sure enough, man, you answer the phone and you walk me through that firmware update, and we had it knocked out in about 20 minutes. It was excellent. So thank you for being that kind of
good. Well,
manufacturer and giving that
I
kind of support. Because I know us guys out there get stuck and we get frustrated, and it's just nice to have somebody that we can call we know is going to answer the phone and help out.
So yeah, we're a small business. I'm the owner, and I make myself available as much as I possibly can.
Hmm.
I'm usually available from about 9 a.m. Pacific time, and well into the evening.
Yeah.
If you want to call me at 10 p.m., you know, I may I may not answer, but I probably
Yeah.
will answer.
Yeah.
And especially if you have an off hours call, like I'm going to be in this setup on Saturday doing it. I wonder if Jim's available. Well, don't wait till
Right.
Saturday to find
Yeah.
out.
Just
Call
schedule
me
it.
during the week. Yeah,
Yeah.
schedule it
Perfect.
and say, I can say, oh, no, I'm really sorry, I've got something, but if you
Yeah.
call me this time, or, what can we do? And I try to be the best support of any company. And I think we have earned that reputation because I answer the phone. I get calls late at night on Friday saying, Jim, I know this is not the Lumagen. I'm
But
stuck. Can
please
you
help.
help?
Yeah.
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 And I mean, if I tell my dealers, if you put a Lumagen in, then I'm there to help. And even if it's not a Lumagen, I mean, I can't fix a broken product from someone else, but I
Totally.
mean,
Yeah.
I've been generally able, in almost all cases, on the phone to get people up and running, at least good enough that they
Hmm.
can, go have their weekend.
Sure.
Um, so it's a tough thing, but I will say too is you got to use the right cables.
Right.
You got to use good cables. If you use off-brand, I mean, or some, I have a lot of people I spent $1,500 on this HDMI cable, and
Yeah.
okay, well, almost certainly it's a bad cable then. Uh,
Hmm.
they
Yeah.
shouldn't cost that much. Um, but there's a few brands that I do run into that are working pretty well, and those are the ones I would end up recommending. And if you do that, then you're just not going to have as many issues, and it just
Right.
makes life easier for you and especially for me, which is
Good.
good for both.
Let me check the question box so far, and I don't think we have any new questions, but somebody else did chime in and said, I second that. That was Matt. We were talking about you answering the phone and helping people. Matt's probably called you before, so yeah, thanks for
Okay, good,
that chime
excellent.
in, Matt. And Jim, we have a few minutes left. I can stay a little bit longer if you can, if the folks want us to, but I think you wanted to show us some of the setup and some of the menu, yes?
Yeah, let's go switch to the menu. I was going to talk
Yeah.
about black level, and what I tell people about black level is that you are good enough to calibrate the black level. You don't need any tools. You don't need the
Hmm.
professional training. It just takes a little practice. And I have 3 slides in my slide set that kind of tell you. I years ago kind of split it out into 2 phases. One is optical black, and one
Hmm.
is digital black.
Right.
And so optical black is getting the projector to be the black to be as black as possible, and then
Hmm.
digital black is adjusting the Lumagen output so that it basically sets the black at the correct
Right.
digital point to get the spot. And definitely have seen that approach works a lot better.
Good.
And I've had people call who weren't calibrators do that, and they call me back and say, I can't believe how much better my picture looks.
Yeah, just from
Um,
that simple adjustment, right?
yes. Uh-huh.
That's
Yeah. So
funny.
black is I call black about, I don't know. I changed the number. It's 75% of the calibration,
Yes,
It's
right.
get it right. You got a good I got a good JVC, a good Sony. There are
Hmm.
some others, but the Sonys and JVCs, the projectors years ago used to always try to get as much light output, and they had the picture was all wrong and looked,
Hmm.
kind of dumb. And now there are modes in these projectors that are pretty accurate. And if you're not going to do a calibration and get in the right mode, then it's not perfect, but it's going to be pretty darn good.
It'll be good, yeah. What I'm going to do, Jim, just so people can see your screen better, I'm going to turn my camera off so everyone can see your screen much bigger. And just so you
Okay.
guys know what Jim's got going on here, he's got the output of his Lumagen into a video converter. So we're actually seeing the output of the Lumagen right now on the screen. So with that being said, you guys should be seeing that full screen. Jim, I'll leave the rest to you.
Okay. Well, let's set a kind of a time budget. How much time do you think, and people can chime in on the text, I guess, should I spend 10 minutes? Should I spend 20 minutes on this? Because I spent 3 hours on this one day in Germany. So,
Oh man. Um, let's start light and let's see kind of where it goes.
okay.
And we'll see what people are saying in the chat box here. But I'm definitely good to go a little or even a lot over if we have to. No big deal on my end. So you do what's comfortable with you, and I'll watch the
Okay.
chat box.
Okay. So let me do it. I'm going to do the 50,000 foot view, and then we can drop down a little bit. So the menu, you may not like the highly saturated colors or the fact that we use more of a curlier font and that gets scaled up. But I like to point out to people, you don't watch the menu system. Is it useful? So I think it's very useful, and people who get used to it say, yeah, it's very logical. And people say, well, can you improve your menu? Says, well, how would you want me to do that? I mean, it's logical. It works very well. If you want an input, you go to the input menu, and there's basically the Lumagen is split. We have a frame buffer in the middle that temporarily stores the video. Then we have, before that, we have the input menu logically. And then after that, we have the output menu logically. Then we have global settings. We have some audio video stuff like global EDID, stuff like that. This other menu, we couldn't think of a good name. It was just everything else, so we called it everything
Other.
else, which is other. um, and so there's a lot of setup things you can do. Menu sizing, I actually have the menu is maxed out size wise. You can make it small, and in fact I recommend go in and set the menu to small. It looks
Hmm.
better. Doesn't cover up as much of the screen, but you can see it, read it, everything like that.
Sure.
Info is when you press OK on a default Lumagen, you get to the info page, and here's info page 1. You can turn that feature off. It turns out a lot of control programmers send extra carriage returns, and it happens for historical reasons. A friend of mine used to call it historical, so it's hysterical. But you get this menu coming up, and if you don't want to get rid of the extraneous carriage returns, you just turn off that feature, and then you can get to the info screens here in the info. We have these quick key things. You can come in here and you can, if you have a 4 or 5 button, simplified remote, you can actually do certain things with that remote. Don't recommend it, but there. And then we have save.
Sure.
Everything has to be saved. But one thing I will see here is we have one level of undo. We have a backup menu that you can load settings into, and I can give you those offline. Just send me an email, I'll give it to you. But in service mode, you just enter menu 0997, and it saves it off to a backup menu. And that exists because we had a calibrator fly from Florida to Texas, do a calibration, fly home, and within a week, the customer had completely messed up his system. He had to fly back to
Oh
Texas.
man.
So basically, if you do a calibration, if your calibrators are out there, at least do the save to the backup menu. So if the
Hmm.
customer screws it up, you can say, well, go here, load the backup, and you'll be back to where we were when we were there.
Good.
Just an aside is we have the ability to download the configuration to a PC compatible. And so you should do that. And then heaven forbid the unit goes south, you have the load and the replacement unit is loaded on, and you don't have to do everything over again. So download your configuration to a PC and save it as a backup if you can.
Good.
And then here is the factory settings, and you can basically here do, I'll just step through here some of these options. So you don't have to reset everything, which really helps if you've already done a calibration, but your aspect ratios are all screwed up and stuff.
Jim,
Go ahead.
I just want to mention real quick, in case anybody does have to drop off, because we are at our hour now. The session is being recorded. It's going to go up on YouTube later today or tomorrow, perhaps. So if you guys do need to drop off and you want to follow up later, no big deal. It's going to be up on YouTube. So just wanted to mention that in case you have to go.
Okay, and then in case people do have to go, here's the left arrow menu. It has a really great name, right? Left arrow menu. And so it only has 4 parameters now. It used to have, I think, 7. And we have this low ratio. We just generally want you to leave it at 31. That basically says, if you set it to 4 to 5 times, it says my actual output of my screen will be right. And so you can see here that I have a low ratio of 31, and so I have an actual light output of 76 nits for dark scenes. Well, unfortunately, my projector's light output has dropped. I used to have about 100, and then it went down to 88. Now it's about 77.
Hmm.
So I've actually changed my settings, and so I've got my dark scenes are at 76. So a dark scene is going to be nit for nit up to 76 nits, basically, almost. You start rolling off a little bit, and then I have this multiplier, which actually makes bright scenes. Basically, if I were to say, my projector was 76 nits on a bright scene, it would get 76 nits and then you would clip. And so what
Right.
we want to be able to do is roll off in a way that a human grader would do if they could grade every frame of the movie. And so you can adjust that, and you can go in here and I can change max light up and down arrows, and you can see as I go up
Oh, you
how
can
it
see your
changes the
screen.
scene. um, it may not look very good on this for your scene, but this is actually in SDR mode. It's actually in 2020, which is wrong, but okay for for the computer. I didn't change that. Didn't think to change that. But now watch what happens when I go back. It got the brightness of the object, the brighter objects,
Hmm.
and then some of the transition and the other parts of the scene changed. Dynamic pad of 2, we recommend you leave it there. I don't have, this is a special release that allows me to output without encryption. And so it's not the latest release. That's why DSAT is 10. Now we have auto DSAT, which is a huge improvement for the desaturation because it works for all levels of scenes. Before, you had to have a really bright, 2000 nit scene or higher for it to actually start kicking in. But now if you have a 300 nit scene or a 500 nit scene or a 1000 nit scene, it works for all those levels because of the dynamic tone mapping. So auto is a good setting, low is a good setting, and if you really want the orange flames and Mad Max to look yellow or more yellow, then you
Hmm.
can use the high setting. That's personal preference. There's reasons for for that because in a real life you might see that
Hmm.
more yellow, and your eye would tend to desaturate the colors.
Uh,
Um, Go
Jim, there was a question that came up. Ladislav asks if this is new firmware or is this, maybe you mentioned this is this custom firmware that you're working on right now?
Um, this firmware I have is actually an older release that Pat did a special version so that I could have it not be encrypted on the
Oh,
output. I
cool.
can't send that to anybody, but I can have it because we're an HTTP licensee.
Sure.
So this is actually real content, but you'll see that if I look at here, the output's not encrypted. Well, we can't do that. We can't tell it. We can't
Right.
give it any, so I can't send this out, and it just happens to you see 042920 was a custom release that he did for me for
Cool.
this. But as far as the usefulness of the menu and how it's structured, it's exactly the same as our normal releases. The current
Cool.
release 080420 is a good release. It's got new input microcode, which we're still, I mean, it's, we got I think we're in really good shape. It fixes some previous issues that were in there, but it's not perfect. And so, we're dependent on the chip vendor for those microcodes. But the latest 0804 release has improvements in dynamic tone mapping with that auto feature for the desaturation control,
Hmm.
and some more tweaking for tough scenes. There are scenes where basically a sun pans in from the side of the screen. That's a really tough scene because you don't get a
Right.
scene cut, and yet the sun is this really bright object, and we don't want it to clip. And so we've done some improvements in that.
Good. Very good. Okay, cool. That answers his question, and no more questions so far. So let's keep going.
Okay. Well, basically, we use a concept called indirection. If you're a C programmer, you know what that is. Um, So basically, if you want to change something for 4K, most likely you're going to want it to change it for all inputs. So if I come in here and change a config for 4K, I'm changing this 4K-0 means anything that points to that, which is everything by default. If I come in here and I change the black level, which you wouldn't want to do probably for that, but I want to change the sizing for 2.4 content. Well, probably want to do that for all the inputs.
Hmm.
Because of this indirection, it changes it for all inputs. But if you want to have it to be different, there's 8 memories, and I could have 8 different setups so that one specifically you have one flyer input that you want to tweak or clip or do, crop it some. And so you can do that, but that's what's called indirection. And you'll see there is actually a memory here for 8 resolutions. And so for each of the input resolutions, there's different memory for that. So 74K is the 4096 wide, which so far we were wondering, but so far we haven't seen any consumer content be that particular
Right.
resolution. And then you have other, which actually we're now using for the Strato special feature, but that's usually for like a PC. If you had a 1024/768 or
Yeah.
some non-video standard come in, it would go to that memory, and you'd be able to set it up uniquely for this input and this input memory. Um, and then here's where a lot of the things happen is in the HDMI input setup. You've got virtual inputs. I can say, hey, I'm on input 3, but I really want to use physical input 1. This is a lot of times if you have us on the output of an AVR and you want to do something different for different sources, you can do that. We don't recommend you put us on the output of an AVR, but if you did that, you could do this. The video aided we talked about.
Hmm.
Let's say we got my DirecTV box on input 3, and I wanted to set my EDID here. I wanted to max it to 1080 so that it didn't, get read the EDID incorrectly.
Hmm.
So I could do that here. HLG is supported. HDR10, Rec 2020, and interlaced. We have all this stuff. So we have some audio EDIDs. We can do, for example, with this source, if it's a DirecTV box or some other, and I only want to report, I can do 2-channel PCM, or I only want to report that I can do, uh, 2-channel 48 or 2-channel 48 killers with
Hmm.
Dolby Digital, or I want to pass back output, or I want to use, well, that's actually, I think that's just two-channel 48 with Dolby Digital was
Hmm.
basic, I think, and then common is everything. And then common with no Atmos is everything but Atmos. So you can do that for a specific input or all
Hmm.
inputs. If you go in the global menu under that, well, actually, I don't know if we have it in the global menu right now. So auto aspect is a key feature for a lot of people. If you have digital sources, you can do HDMI plus input in the US. If you're in Europe, apparently some of the HDMI devices actually get that half feature out of HDMI wrong,
Hmm.
which then you go to image only. If you're going to use auto aspect, I recommend that you have sticky override on. That way, if you're in like watching Batman Begins and this aspect starts changing on you and
Oh
you don't
yeah.
like that, like me, you can click an aspect ratio and we'll stick with it
I
until
just
something changes like the input.
I just rewatched Aquaman over the weekend. I've only seen it once, and the disc, as looks awesome. It's like, let me watch this movie again. I haven't watched it in a while. Totally forgot that movie changes aspect ratios. It's funny you mentioned that.
My wife complained, "Hey, this movie, something's broken. It
Yeah,
was
right.
changing the picture." I go, "Oh,
Exactly.
that's the movie."
Yep. That's the movie. You got it.
uh-huh. NLS when applicable, we have a nonlinear stretch. Some people have like 235 screen and they want 16:9 to fill the screen.
Right.
So this is a programmable way to stretch. So you can stretch a constant amount in the middle where people are really mostly looking at, and
Hmm.
stretch more and more as you go out toward the side. So um, um, letterbox zoom. If you had, this was really when you had a 4:3 television and you were watching a 16:9 movie, zoom it in so that you fill the height of the screen.
Hmm.
And so typically you would turn this off in nowadays. And then there's some more features here that you can apply this to one input or all inputs. and you can apply to one memory or all in memory. And there's a new feature that's not here, that you can actually merge 235 and 240 into a single output aspect or input aspect selection, and 178 and 185, because is content that is right in the mix, and you can see it, sometimes it might even change between those two, and that just makes it better. I leave Genlock off. Scale bias, you can have it to be off or on, depending on your setup. And then we have this HDR setup. This is the back doorway to get in, and I can do all these extra. There's more stuff here. If a source reports 0 for its max CLL, which is dumb, but they do, then this is what the default will be. And if you're like playing a game, they report 0 and have 10,000 nits, you would change this to 10,000 for your game source and stuff. And then we have the dynamic controls. There's different types of dynamic. We have it with adaptive, without adaptive, and stuff. And you can set defaults again. So let me pop into the output menu, and then I'm trying to get done here real quick. You have output setup menu, which confusing to people. You can see I'm on this 2D line. If I press OK, I go into the change menu. And what I can actually do if I hit the digit 4, there's actually a help button. Let me show you. I'll press the help button. And so you can see that some help comes up on the screen. It tells you some stuff, what you can do. And then you just press help again and it goes away. Well, maybe. There we go. And so I can press the digit 4 and then notice that everything went to dash it. That's okay. Because I can only report one input memory, one input mode. If I change that to like all inputs, well, I can't report them all in this menu, and it wouldn't make sense to try. So we basically, and you can see here that I can change the input number, the memory, and the mode. The mode, there's a whole mode list, so you can do certain things differently for different input resolutions. And the output mode is selected for this, and of course, this one I dumbed down to 1080p 60 for the capture, just because I thought it would be better. But you'll see there's a column for 601709 CMS, for HDR 2020 CMS, and that's 0 and 1 respectively. And then there's a style. There's 8 styles. There's 8 CMSs, and then in the output here. So I have A for audio, output 1's audio only, B 2, that's both. 3 is not on because it's an 18 gigahertz output. Turns out that the way the chip works is you can't really have audio on the audio only output and not have audio on the video output, which is weird, but that's the way the chip works. There were some bugs trying to do it the other way. So if I change this, you'll see that if I go here to both, I get the audio there. So if I turn audio off there, then I can have both, or I can have video. So there's some limits in that. But this is your output setup menu. It's not as complicated as it first looks, and you can do separate things for 2D and 3D. An important menu, if you do the direct codes for setting the output, like I would say menu 0873 and then 0872 to add 24 hertz. If you do those, you don't need to use this menu. Or if you have the outputs in the way you want, but sometimes we need to change. For example, if you have a 9 gigahertz output, a few now, audio processors don't implement all the audio interrupts in HDMI. At least that's what we think that's going on. And so you actually have to enable video on the audio output so they see the video changing, and then they know to change the audio. Bad design on their part, but it does exist, and that's a way if you have a 9 gigahertz output, which was the second reason why I recommended the 9.
Jim, are you still seeing a lot of 3D in your travels?
No, hardly ever.
Yeah, same here at this point.
Not gone, but hardly ever.
Yeah.
And I even considered making our theater a 2-projector 3D theater, but it just really wasn't worth the money. And we have the capability here with glasses, but no one wants to watch it. And on this biggest screen, we just wouldn't have enough light output.
Sure.
So we don't do that. Custom modes, you can do custom modes. This is more for LED walls now. They have like 2560 by 1440, so you can do custom resolutions for video walls. CMSs, Again, we're using these are what's actually happening in the CMS for HDR in this case, because it's got the asterisk. You'll see there's an asterisk to the left. That means this is the active one. And you'll see there's a check mark to the right of CMS 0 and 1. That means that some memory somewhere references this memory. Before I did a factory reset a while back, all of them were used because I had different setups, different testing, doing a lot of testing and stuff. So, and you can basically do 3D LUT. You set the color space. This is one you might actually end up using if you're going to set the output to SDR 2020 from the default, the new default of SDR 709. Generally leave the HDR flag off. There is a JVC special case. It only works with JVCs where you can actually set the HDR flag on for HDR, but tell the projector to use a 2.4 gamma and not use the 2084 gamma.
Got it.
But I'm not doing that anymore because I have one color space. If you switch the HDR flag on and off, that's actually an output restart. Don't want to,
right.
you don't want to do that. So now for both SDR and HDR content, I have my output set to SDR 2020, HDR flag off, and I turn auto convert on, even though for HDR you don't need to convert it. It just, if you can get HDR, that's 709. And with the auto convert on, not very common, but it can exist, then it would happen. If you got HDR 709, we would then correctly convert it for the 2020 output.
That's good.
So I just say leave auto convert on. The only time you turn it off is when you're calibrating. 21-point grayscale, color black and white. These are two you might do when you do your black level. And then we have HDR mapping, which is where you would normally set your max light initially, but you have to turn intensity mapping. That's what we first called it, HDR intensity mapping, tone mapping. You have to have it on, but now with the latest software release, if you do a factory reset, it will turn itself on. One thing to be aware of, if you have an older release and go to the newest release, it doesn't automatically change your factory settings. So if you have, let's say you bought a unit a few months ago, when you open it, get it out of the box, do a factory reset, then do a save, and you have the current defaults. And you can label things. And we have styles. Styles very important. We have, like what kind of type we're going to output, where we're going to do a rate match. Reduced max, that's a Sony 5000 feature. I call the Sony 5000's 18 gigahertz input a 17 gigahertz input because it works fine at 17.
We've run into
or
that
you can
too.
run it at 9. Yeah, so we can reduce that that's specifically for the Sony 5000. It might work with some others, but for example, it does not work with the Sony 885 or the 995.
Hey, Jim, I've got to mute my mic for 10 seconds. Keep going. I'll be right back.
Okay, mask and shrink. So this is going to be useful for shrinking. Oh, what did I do? Sorry. There we go. Let me go back. I pushed the wrong button, I think. What will happen here is if I had a 240 screen but no anamorphic lens, I would have about 10 to 12% in these numbers for top and bottom shrink to adjust the height of the image. I have an anamorphic screen and I just ended up with 1% at the top just to dial that in. We do horizontal keystone or vertical keystone correction, and you can set the gray bars to 0, which that's the default. Aspect ratio, you'll see here right now, I'm actually doing kind of a cheat. Oops, I go before you're going to see that. You'll see that for now, I have everything set to 235 except 240 is 240, and then what I'm doing is I'm cheating. 2.0 content fills the screen now because I lied to the Lumagen, and 2.0 content almost fills the screen because I lied again to the Lumagen. But I didn't. There was too much to try to do for 16:9, so I just left everything at 235. You can do interesting things like that, and then you can actually do things that will crop the image and do various things if you want to get fancy with dialing the image into the customer's desires.
I'm seeing more and more and more screens that are 235 or 240. more than I've seen in the past for sure.
Yep. Yeah. Or 2.0 is a common one. 2.2 is
Mm-hmm.
actually, not as common, but it's happening. And so basically, you can set, if you had a 2.0 screen, let's say, you could say, I'm going to set the screen at 2.0,
Mm-hmm.
and or you could say, hey, 178, that's not that far. It's
Mm-hmm.
10%. A 10% stretch. If I fill my screen, I'll be happy. And you can do that, and you'll fill your screen. And then if you want to crop a little, you on top and bottom to make it less of a stretch, you can do that. So there's tricks you can do. I do experiments on my guests sometimes, and
Oh yeah.
I'll set one of these up and see, is anyone going to complain, and see how
Mm-hmm.
much I can stretch it before people say, hey, those people look fat. What's going on?
Yeah, that's funny.
And so, but just do your own experiments, and it may make sense for you, it may not. I was
Mm-hmm.
watching a 2.2 thing on Netflix, I think, and I just said, I'm going to try it, and so I did. And that's where I happened to be today, is I hadn't undone that, and I did not notice the fact that that's only like a 7%
Right.
stretch, but I did not notice that it was stretched. It looked perfectly fine, and it filled the width of the screen, which I liked. Um,
If anyone's looking, by the way, for some 220 content, I know for sure um, the film series by Ron Frick. I can never pronounce the first one, but the second one is Baraka and the third one is Samsara. Those two discs are 220. In case anybody out there is listening and is wondering about 220 content, Jim mentioned something on Netflix he saw, and I know those two discs for sure. So if you're looking for
mhm.
some 220 stuff, look for those.
Well, if you want to find out for sure, if you're watching Netflix, turn on auto aspect, and the
Hmm.
Lumagen will tell you what the aspect is, because we'll
Oh, cool.
figure it out.
Good.
So, but that's kind of a basic introduction here. You can come in and you have different pages of the info page, and they give you different information. One thing
Hmm.
interesting, the output devices capability on this page, you can see that my output 2, I'm currently driving the little capture device at on a 9 gigahertz card, just because
Hmm.
probably easier for it.
It'll work.
Um,
Yeah. You know it'll work.
and so yeah, so it says it can do 18 gigahertz though. So yeah,
Hmm.
the capture card can do 18 gigahertz, but I just plugged it into the 9, so you can see what does this device say it can do. But it does say it can't do HTTP. So unless you have my special software, you can't
Yeah.
use
Right.
it. And then we have other interesting things, like the input aspect is 235, the output aspect is 235. We have the scalar, some other stuff, some historical stuff that's not quite right. And then some other historical stuff that it's all for Patrick. I don't even know most of this.
Yeah.
But
That's funny.
actually, one thing you can do, people say, well, I don't know tell me what my unit has. And I'll say, well, okay, press OK 4 times, get to info page 4, look at the lower left corner, and in yellow, it'll say 18G colon. And the decoder ring for this is each letter is one card. And the
Hmm.
slash is the separation between inputs and outputs. So I have 4 input cards. They're all there. If they weren't, there'd be a dash. And I have 9 gigahertz for my input 1 and 2, and then all the rest are 18. And that's because I have a 1080 DirecTV box on input 1, and I have my CoStar on input 2. I just literally changed that yesterday
Hmm.
from an 18 gigahertz card, and that way it's going to be a little faster and everything. And then I
Sure.
have a 9 gigahertz output, and I have an 18 gigahertz output, and then the comma 0 says I'm using output microcode 0 instead of 1. And there's 2. You can use both. I could use 1. It works fine with the JVCs. Version 1 doesn't really work well with some of the Sony. So, and the real difference is the version 1 is slightly lower jitter, but it doesn't work with as much as the 1 does, the 0 does in here. So, um, okay, so I can keep going, but that was kind of like the quick running tour. I
Oh
just call
yeah.
this the walking tour of the Lumagen menu. So that was the running tour of the Lumagen menu. Give you some ideas. If you have questions, feel free to call me. If I don't answer, please leave a message, but call my cell phone. It's much easier. I've had people on site call the work number, and because I was on the phone, I didn't check emails, and
Oh sure.
by the time I got the voice message, um, they were gone. So,
Yeah.
it's like, okay, call my cell phone. And you should have that if you're a dealer, or, um, It's not on the website, but you can always call the main number or send an email to sales. I'll respond with my number. Um, and I think that's a good stopping point.
Cool, awesome, Jim. Thank you so much. That's exactly what the folks who are listening to the last webinar wanted. They wanted just a kind of an introduction to the Lumagen, and you've definitely provided that for them. So thank you so much. You know, maybe later down the road we could do an advanced walkthrough of the menu or something. Let's see what the folks out there are thinking. And guys, feel free to send me any emails, any feedback or questions that you might have for Meridio or AVPro or even for Jim. I could field those questions to Jim. My email address is real simple. It's jason@avproglobal.com. Jim's website is just lumagen.com. You can find out all the information you need on the processors there, and you can get a hold of them there if you need to. So guys, with that being said, we've been about at 90 minutes. So thank you so much for hanging out. We had some great questions. Thanks for those questions, guys. And Jim, if you don't have anything else for everybody, I think it's a good point to call it a day.
Well, very good. No, I think that's good. If you have any questions, do call me or email, and appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jim, and we'll talk to everybody soon and see you on the next one.